My name is Kristin Bruce. I participated in the MPP program, so the Masters of Public Policy, and my research focused on water governance in Saskatchewan. In my master's thesis project, I wanted to understand, I guess, what kind of governance model the organization that kind of makes decisions for water in Saskatchewan is using. And what I wanted to look for was activities of anticipatory governance, which is a governance model that focuses on kind of proactive thinking, stakeholder engagement, and then iterative change. So basically changing things based on real world results when you kind of get them in a quicker manner. So I kind of had that framework, and I collected data from stakeholder interviews, some document analysis, and I also did the social network and survey and analysis afterwards. So social network analysis basically assumes that all kind of social reality is created through relationships, be that between people or kind of between the environment and other things or other kind of entities. And it focuses on the ties between each thing or each person. So that's kind of the method in and of itself. And it just looks at how kind of information or other social goods travel through the network and kind of makes maps and then looks at the patterns through a computer program. So beginning the method, you have to use a survey, and one of the things I probably could have improved a little bit was the questions that I asked within the survey, but we'll probably get into that a bit later. So you ask your participants to fill in a survey, and they basically fill questions in with how they know people. In my research, I wanted to understand how people communicated about water uses or water issues in a specific region in Saskatchewan. So I asked them who they talked to about water within their kind of work network, I would guess. And then the network map that kind of came out was interesting to me because there was a lot of kind of cross-sectoral communication between nonprofit, environmental kind of consulting firms, those in the municipal government, those in agriculture, both in the private and the public sector, but very limited interaction with those from the potash sector. So it was a unique map in that way. To create the map, you use a software program, or you can use a number of software programs, but I worked with the Social Science Research Lab here at the University of Saskatchewan, and they use UCINet, and then they use NetDraw. And I think that those are both free softwares, but I was allowed to kind of attend some workshops on how to understand how to use the program. So I used those, and basically when you're asking the survey questions, a participant will fill in the survey and they'll just give the name and organization title with everyone that they communicate with water about. And then anytime that there was a cross, I would have like a 1 in my social network matrix instead of a 0. And if there was no cross, there would be zeros. When I was analyzing the data, unfortunately, zeros don't work inside the model. The way the program works, you need to use 1s and 2s. So that was something that I needed to go back and fix later, unfortunately. I think the value is it analyzes kind of what's going on within a specific context. So the communication patterns that I wanted to look at and how people kind of talk about water or think about it. So kind of the first part of that question is who are people actually talking to and who are a part of those potentially more collaborative groups. So anticipatory governance, one of the activities of that framework is increased collaboration across all stakeholders that are using water. So my social network map, basically I wanted to see, is there collaboration between stakeholders and across sectors, and who's at the center of the map? So who has the most power to either kind of hold information or spread it throughout? So that, I guess, is the value for me, because I wanted to kind of look at those people and how they're talking about water in that specific context. The problem with the method, I guess, is that a social network map is only a snapshot in time. So anything can kind of disrupt the map after I'm there, or it can improve the collaboration after the map. So any kind of event on either end of those spectrums. So you just have to kind of remember that when you're talking about it after. And so in presentations, I kind of remember to give that as like a little byline. Yeah. So some of the challenges that I kind of went through when I was designing my survey was I had a very hard time getting ethics approval, actually, because I wasn't using expert opinions, because I was just kind of talking with stakeholders about their personal perspective of water and what they do in their work with their personal opinion. But I needed their name and their organization, and then I also needed them to list everyone's name and organization that they kind of communicate with water about. So that was potentially a privacy confidentiality issue for our ethics board. And actually it was resolved pretty easily. They asked me to submit kind of a 2-page explanation of what the method is, who uses it, how often it's been done before, and then just some extra kind of how am I going to make sure that this is confidential information. So the way that I did that is I actually stripped out the information from the map. So they're all kind of like alphanumeric codes. So participants are like XZ2 or something. And then all I could do in the map to kind of show the sectoral communication was color code the map. So if you're from kind of like a environmental consulting firm, you were green. If you were kind of from the potash industry, you were pink. So there was some kind of ways that I could give some information still about the map so it was still valuable, but that was a little bit of a stumbling block before I could even get out and do the research. And then I guess, obviously, I mentioned before the analysis part. I wasn't very familiar with how the computer programs worked, so I just made my matrix wrong. And that was a quick fix once we understood what was going on. The matrix still, with the zeros and ones, still drew the map perfectly. It just couldn't run the statistical analysis. So there's a few things that social network maps can tell you, so about kind of who has the power and who's highly connected and how connected are you in relation to everyone else. And so they're called measures of centrality, and we just couldn't run those until I changed my matrix. So it was a stumbling block, but it just kind of took some understanding and then a little fixing on the back end. The initial kind of two methods I used was a document analysis. So again, I had the rubric of kind of anticipatory governance activities and what those might be. And then also my kind of comparator was traditional water governance approaches and the activities that are associated with those things. So I went through the 25-year water security plan and just basically coded for both of those frameworks. And then I did the same thing with my participant interviews. So I kind of had those two methods and they were very contradictory. So on paper, there was a lot more anticipatory governance kind of items and activities going on. And then on the ground is what I call my participant interviews. There was more the traditional kind of water governance approach coming through people's, basically their conversations and what they were telling me about how it actually works in the region that I looked at. So that was interesting in and of itself. And then the social network map was kind of just the cherry to push it over onto the other side. And what I mean by that is I wanted to look at how people were actually communicating and which sectors were communicating. And it turned out in the end that the person that holds the most power in the network is still a very traditional water governance person. So it would suggest that it's more likely the case that it is on the ground. So the approach is still very traditional, even though on paper we have changed or moved forward. Like the interest that social networks and even just social kind of apps that people are using, like that's a way to use social network mapping and social network analysis and any actually just using the internet and which sites you visit, that can all be mapped in a network, and communication of any kind. So kind of colleague to colleague, relative to relative, or students, it can all kind of be mapped in that way and present that visual data for just a different level of analysis. So I think it is very flexible. It just depends what you're after, and then you just have to make sure that your questions are suitable for what you actually want to use it for. I would suggest that if I was giving advice to someone just starting with the method kind of into the future, just prepare to kind of explain to people what it is. Because it's a bit confusing when you just kind of sit down with someone and ask them to write down a bunch of people they talk about something with, or if they know someone, or any number of kind of social relations. So that can be a bit tricky, and sometimes it's kind of invasive for people, or they feel like they don't understand why you're asking these questions and wonder what you're going to do with the information if you're going to contact their list of people. So just be kind of open and honest and just prepare for those questions so that you can have that discussion with whomever you're kind of surveying, if you're there in person, or kind of put it into the preamble as best you can. Joy when I finally got my map to populate. So using the method, I'd, like I said, struggled a bit with using the computer program, and so I felt a little frustrated. But when it finally populated the map, I found the visual data, well, quite intriguing, and it's very beautiful to look at. So that was really kind of the most joy that I had. And then also it was interesting because it did distinctly show what the participants were kind of saying in a visual presentation. So it was just a different way to do it, and I really liked that. I think you could, depending on your question, use the method as a standalone, especially because there are additional, besides centrality measures, there are additional statistics that you can run. And if you're using a snowball kind of sample, depending like how large the network you want, it gets more reliable. So you could, but I don't know, it would depend what you were after, really.